Good morning and welcome to the Clovis Brief. I'm your host, and this is Wednesday, May 20th, 2026. Let's start with what's happening outside your window here in northern Illinois. Right now, it's 58 degrees, feeling more like 53 with an 11-mile-per-hour wind, and we've got overcast skies dominating the scene. Today's high will reach about 57.5 degrees with a low of 45, and those grey skies are sticking around. Tomorrow, Thursday, looks similar, high of nearly 59, low of 41, still overcast. Friday brings our first precipitation of the period with drizzle expected and about 0.087 inches of rain, temperatures in the upper 50s. The good news, the weekend's looking better. Saturday climbs to almost 71 degrees, though we'll see more rain with about 0.13 inches expected. Sunday clears up nicely with a high of 74 and a low of 56 under overcast skies. So if you've been waiting for warmer weather, it's coming, just have to get through this cool, grey stretch first. Now, what's on deck for today's episode? We're diving into a major cloud infrastructure incident that's raising serious questions about how platform providers handle account suspensions. Google just announced their latest AI model, Gemini 3.5 Flash, and the reaction from the developer community is intense. There's a significant security story developing around GitHub, reports of a breach involving thousands of repositories through a compromised Visual Studio Code extension. We'll walk through CISA's latest additions to the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, including some concerning issues with Microsoft Defender. The Unit 42 team has published new research on threat actor infrastructure tracking, and we've got fresh machine learning research from Archive covering everything from EEG signal processing to flood prediction systems. It's a packed show, so let's get into it. Let's jump into tech news, and we need to start with what happened at Railway yesterday. Hacker News is covering their incident report extensively. It's the top story with over 170 points. Railway is a platform-as-a-service company, and on May 19th, their entire Google Cloud Platform account was suspended without warning. This wasn't a billing issue or a minor service disruption. Google completely shut down their access, taking Railway's production infrastructure offline and affecting thousands of their customers. What makes this particularly significant is the lack of communication. According to Railway's detailed incident report, they received no advance notice, no explanation of what triggered the suspension, and initially had enormous difficulty even reaching someone at Google who could help. They were essentially locked out of their own infrastructure with their customers' applications down. The suspension lasted several hours before Google restored access, and even then, the explanation was vague. This story is generating intense discussion, because it highlights a fundamental risk in cloud computing that many organizations don't adequately plan for. When you build your entire business on top of another company's infrastructure, you're exposed to what we might call platform risk. Your provider can essentially flip a switch and shut you down, and if you don't have the right support contracts or relationships, you might have no recourse. Over on Hacker News, there's even an Ask HN thread with 76 points, asking whether Google needs to give a public statement about this incident. The consensus seems to be that yes, they do, because if this can happen to Railway, a legitimate business with paying customers, it can happen to anyone. The broader implication here is about redundancy and multi-cloud strategies. Railway likely learned a very expensive lesson about having all their eggs in one basket. Smart infrastructure planning means having the ability to fail over to a different provider, even if it's not instantaneous. But that's expensive and complex, and many companies, especially startups, simply can't afford that level of redundancy. Moving to AI developments, Google announced Gemini 3.5 Flash at their I/O conference, and Hacker News is all over this with 925 points and over 600 comments. This is Google's latest large language model, positioned as their answer to GPT-4 and Claude. The Flash designation indicates this is optimized for speed and efficiency rather than being their absolute largest model. What's interesting about the community reaction is the skepticism. Many commenters are questioning whether this represents genuine progress or just another incremental release in an increasingly crowded field. There's a growing sense that we might be hitting diminishing returns on simply scaling up these models. The real question isn't just, is it better? It's, is it meaningfully better in ways that matter for actual applications? Ars Technica is also covering this, reporting that Google is planning to remake search with what they're calling agentic AI in 2026. That means AI systems that can take actions on your behalf, not just answer questions. The implications are enormous. Imagine searching for a restaurant and having the AI not just find options, but actually make a reservation, or searching for a product and having it compare prices, read reviews, and potentially even complete a purchase. This is either the future of how we interact with information or a privacy nightmare, depending on your perspective. Over on Lobstars, there's a post with 153 points titled, "Type Out the Code." This is an essay arguing against the rising trend of letting AI write all your code for you. The author makes a compelling case that physically typing out code, even when you're copying or adapting it from somewhere else, helps you understand it better. There's a cognitive benefit to the mechanical act of typing that we lose when we just paste in AI-generated code blocks. This ties into a broader conversation happening in the development community about the long-term effects of AI coding assistance. Are we training a generation of developers who can prompt an AI but can't actually read and understand code? What happens when the AI makes subtle mistakes that you don't catch because you never really looked at what it generated? These aren't hypothetical concerns, they're already showing up in code reviews. Mozilla has announced they're saying goodbye to asm.js, as covered in a post with 209 points on Hacker News. For those who don't remember, asm.js was a subset of JavaScript that could be highly optimized by browsers, allowing near-native performance for certain types of code. It was hugely important in the early days of running things like games in the browser, but WebAssembly has essentially superseded it, offering better performance and a more robust compilation target. This is the end of an era, but also a sign of how far web technologies have come. The fact that we can now compile C, C++, Rust, and other languages directly to WebAssembly and run them in browsers at near-native speed would have seemed like science fiction 15 years ago. There's a story trending about Google that's more concerning, a tweet from Pokemon Central with 222 points simply titled, "Apparently Google hates us now." This is about Google's search algorithms deprioritizing or outright blocking certain content creators from appearing in search results. The details are murky, but it appears to be related to Google's efforts to combat SEO manipulation and AI-generated content spam. The problem is that legitimate creators are getting caught in the crossfire. BBC Future has a related article about how Google's AI is being manipulated and how they're quietly fighting back. This is the arms race of the modern internet, spammers trying to game AI systems, AI companies trying to detect and block them, and legitimate users stuck in the middle. Bleeping Computer is reporting on a critical Drupal update that fixes a bug with high exploitation risk. Drupal is a popular content management system that powers millions of websites, and when they issue a critical security update, you need to pay attention. The vulnerability could allow attackers to compromise sites, and proof-of-concept exploits are likely to emerge quickly. If you're running Drupal, this needs to be at the top of your patching priority list. There's also news about a vulnerability in ChromaDB, which Bleeping Computer describes as having max severity and allowing server hijacking. ChromaDB is a vector database commonly used in AI applications for storing and querying embeddings. The fact that a database designed specifically for AI workloads has a critical vulnerability is concerning because these systems are being rapidly deployed without the same security scrutiny that traditional databases receive. This is part of a broader pattern we're seeing where the rush to deploy AI is outpacing security considerations. Finally, there's a fascinating piece with 421 points on Hacker News titled, "Everything in C is Undefined Behavior." This is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but also deeply serious exploration of how the C programming language specification is filled with undefined behavior, situations where the language standard doesn't specify what should happen. This means the compiler is free to do literally anything, and what works today might break tomorrow with a compiler update. The author argues that modern C has become so complex and so full of edge cases that writing truly portable, correct C code is nearly impossible. This has major implications for system security because undefined behavior is a common source of vulnerabilities. It's a long-running debate in the systems programming community, but with memory-safe languages like Rust gaining traction, we might finally be seeing the beginning of the end of C's dominance in low-level programming. Time for our security briefing, and we need to start with CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog because they've added several significant entries that need your immediate attention. First up, CISA added CVE 2026-41091 on May 20th, with a due date of June 3rd. This is a link following vulnerability in Microsoft Defender that allows an authorized attacker to elevate privileges locally. Microsoft Defender is installed on virtually every Windows system, so the attack surface here is enormous. The fact that this made it onto CISA's KEV catalog means there's evidence of active exploitation in the wild. Schneier on Security has coverage of related Windows 0-day issues, noting that Microsoft has shared mitigation steps while they work on a full patch. Also added on May 20th is CVE 2026-45498, another Microsoft Defender vulnerability, this one allowing for denial of service. The lack of detailed information in the CISA listing is somewhat concerning. It's described as an unspecified vulnerability, which usually means either the details are being kept quiet to slow exploitation, or it was discovered through incident response, and the full scope isn't yet understood. Krebs on Security is reporting something that should make everyone in federal IT sit up straight. A CISA administrator leaked AWS GovCloud keys on GitHub. This is almost too on the nose to be real. The agency responsible for coordinating cybersecurity for the federal government had one of their own staff accidentally expose credentials for Amazon Web Services' government cloud platform. GovCloud is specifically designed for sensitive government workloads with compliance requirements. These credentials, if accessed by adversaries, could potentially provide access to classified or sensitive systems. Krebs notes that the credentials were discovered by security researchers scanning public GitHub repositories, which means they were potentially exposed for an unknown period before being detected. This underscores why credential scanning and secrets management are so critical. Even security professionals make mistakes, and you need automated systems to catch them. Bleeping Computer has a detailed report on the Grafana breach, which they're attributing to a missed token rotation after the Tanstack attack. This is a perfect example of how supply chain compromises can have cascading effects. Tanstack, a popular open-source library, was compromised earlier this year, and Grafana was using it. Even though Grafana responded to the Tanstack compromise, they missed rotating one set of tokens, and that oversight led to their own breach. The lesson here is that incident response checklists need to be comprehensive, and you need to track every single credential and token that might have been exposed. Missing even one can undo all your other remediation work. Microsoft has shared mitigation for what's being called the Yellow Key Windows 0-day. Bleeping Computer and Schneier on Security both have coverage of this. Yellow Key is a BitLocker bypass vulnerability that allows an attacker with physical access to a device to access encrypted data. Schneier's coverage emphasizes that this is a 0-day, meaning it was being exploited before Microsoft had a patch available. The mitigation steps Microsoft has provided are temporary measures while they work on a proper fix. If you're relying on BitLocker for full disk encryption, especially on devices that might be physically accessed by adversaries, like laptops used for travel, you need to review these mitigation steps immediately. Now let's talk about the GitHub situation, because this is evolving rapidly. Bleeping Computer reports that GitHub has confirmed a breach of 3,800 repositories via a malicious Visual Studio Code extension. LobStarS has additional coverage noting that a group called Team PCP is claiming responsibility. The attack vector here is particularly clever and concerning. They distributed a Trojanized VS Code extension that, when installed by developers, would steal credentials and access tokens. Those credentials were then used to access the developer's GitHub repositories. 3,800 repositories is a significant number, but the bigger concern is what was in those repositories. Many developers store credentials, API keys, and other secrets in private repositories, mistakenly believing that private means secure. If those repositories were accessed, the attackers potentially have credentials for production systems, cloud infrastructure, databases, and more. GitHub is investigating whether any of their own internal repositories were compromised. The SANS Internet Storm Center has published analysis of Team PCP's supply chain campaign, tracking activity through May 17th. What makes this particularly insidious is that it exploits trust in the developer ecosystem. VS Code extensions are widely used, and developers generally trust the extension marketplace. This attack demonstrates that supply chain security isn't just about the libraries you import, it's also about the tools you use to write code. Organizations need to audit what extensions their developers are using and consider restricting installations to approved extensions only. Bleeping Computer also reports on an exploit released for a new privilege escalation flaw in Arch Linux, called pin theft. This allows a local attacker to escalate to root privileges. Arch Linux is popular among enthusiasts and in some server deployments, and root escalation vulnerabilities are always serious. The fact that an exploit has already been released means this will be weaponized quickly. If you're running Arch, patching needs to happen immediately. Let's walk through some of the older vulnerabilities that CISA added to the KEV catalog, because even though they're from years ago, they're being exploited now. CVE 2008-4250 is a buffer overflow in Windows Server service that allows remote code execution. This is from 2008, nearly 18 years old, yet it's still exploitable on unpatched systems. CVE 2009-1537 is a null byte overwrite vulnerability in DirectX. CVE 2009-3459 is a heap-based buffer overflow in Adobe Acrobat and Reader. These are all ancient by security standards, but CISA doesn't add vulnerabilities to the KEV catalog unless they're seeing active exploitation. The pattern here is concerning. Attackers are still successfully exploiting vulnerabilities that are over a decade old. This tells us that patch management is failing at scale. Organizations are running systems they've forgotten about, or they're running legacy applications that can't be updated, or they simply don't have effective patch management processes. Whatever the reason, these old vulnerabilities remain dangerous. Moving to newer issues, CVE 2026-42897 is a cross-site scripting vulnerability in Microsoft Exchange Server that was added on May 15th. Exchange is a massive attack surface because it's both internet-facing and deeply integrated into corporate networks. Cross-site scripting in a mail server can be leveraged for credential theft, spreading malware, and pivoting into internal networks. The National Vulnerability Database is showing some interesting entries as well. CVE 1999-0095, with a CVSS score of 10.0, involves the debug command being enabled in SendMail. SendMail is ancient mail server software, and the fact that NVD is publishing details on vulnerabilities from 1999 suggests either archival work or, more worryingly, that these old systems are still out there and being scanned by attackers. CVE 1999-0082 is an FTP vulnerability allowing root access, also with a perfect 10 score. These are being documented now because automated scanning has found them on internet-facing systems. Schneier on Security has a post on AI security that's worth noting in this context. As we rush to deploy AI systems, we're creating new attack surfaces and new categories of vulnerabilities. Adversarial inputs, model poisoning, data exfiltration through prompts, these are all new security challenges that many organizations aren't prepared to handle. Schneier argues that we need to develop AI security as its own discipline, with its own frameworks and best practices, rather than trying to shoestring it into existing security programs. Krebs on Security has also been covering the Canvas breach that's disrupting schools and colleges nationwide. Canvas is a learning management system used by thousands of educational institutions, and a compromise that potentially exposes student data, grades, communications, and more. The education sector has historically been under-resourced for cybersecurity, and attackers know it. These systems hold valuable data and often have weaker security than commercial enterprises. The takeaway from today's security briefing is multi-layered. First, patch management remains critically important even for old vulnerabilities. Second, supply chain security now extends to every tool in your development environment. Third, new technology categories like AI are creating new security challenges we're not fully prepared for. And fourth, privileged access and credential management remain fundamental. Whether it's AWS Gov Cloud keys on GitHub or tokens missed after the TANstack compromise, credential exposure is still one of the most common paths to compromise. Let's move into threat intelligence and the research coming out of Palo Alto Network's Unit 42 team. Unit 42 has published new research on tracking tampered chef clusters via certificate and code reuse. Tampered chef is a command and control infrastructure that threat actors are using to manage compromised systems. What makes this research significant is the methodology. Unit 42 is demonstrating how seemingly innocuous technical details like TLS certificates and code patterns can be used to track threat actor infrastructure across different campaigns and targets. When threat actors set up command and control servers, they often reuse infrastructure components. Maybe they use the same certificate authority, or they copy-paste configuration code, or they use the same hosting providers. Each of these decisions leaves traces that threat intelligence teams can use to connect the dots. In this case, Unit 42 found that multiple tampered chef clusters share certificate characteristics and code patterns that suggest they're operated by the same actor or group. Why does this matter? Because tracking threat actor infrastructure helps defenders anticipate attacks. If you can identify that a new domain or IP address is associated with a known threat actor based on these fingerprints, you can block it proactively rather than waiting for it to be used in an attack against your organization. This is the essence of threat intelligence, moving from reactive to proactive defense. Unit 42 has also published research on Gremlin Stealer's evolved tactics. Gremlin Stealer is a credential theft tool that's been around for a while, but the threat actors behind it are constantly updating their techniques. The latest evolution involves hiding malicious code in Windows resource files. Resource files are typically used to store things like icons, dialogues, and strings that applications use, but they can also contain arbitrary data. By embedding malicious code in resource files, the attackers are making it harder for traditional antivirus to detect their malware, because these files are considered legitimate parts of applications. This technique represents the ongoing cat-and-mouse game of malware development and detection. Every time defenders get better at detecting a particular technique, attackers adapt. The resource file technique works because many security tools don't deeply inspect resource files, assuming they're benign. Organizations need to ensure their endpoint protection solutions are checking all file types, not just executables and scripts. The Unit 42 team has also released research on Active Directory Certificate Services exploitation, unpacking advanced misuse techniques and tools. This is particularly relevant given the Microsoft vulnerabilities we discussed earlier. Active Directory Certificate Services, or ADCS, is used in many Windows environments to issue and manage digital certificates. But it's complex, often misconfigured, and when attackers gain access to it, they can issue themselves certificates that grant them persistent access to the network. The research details specific attack techniques like certificate template abuse, where attackers modify templates to grant themselves excessive permissions, and certificate authority compromise, where they gain control of the CA itself and can issue arbitrary certificates. These attacks are especially dangerous because certificates are trusted by default in the environment, so an attacker with a valid certificate can move through the network with minimal friction. Palo Alto Networks issued a threat brief on the exploitation of a PAN-OS captive portal 0-day for unauthenticated remote code execution. This is their own product, the operating system that runs on Palo Alto firewalls. The fact that they're publicly documenting exploitation of their own 0-day vulnerability demonstrates a commitment to transparency, but it's also concerning because Palo Alto firewalls are widely deployed in enterprise environments. The vulnerability in the captive portal feature, that's the component that presents login pages to users connecting to guest networks, allows an unauthenticated attacker to achieve remote code execution. That means someone on the internet can potentially compromise your firewall without any credentials. Unit 42's threat brief includes indicators of compromise and guidance on detection, but the primary mitigation is to patch immediately. They've also published analysis on copy fail, which they describe as the most severe Linux threat in years. Copy fail, tracked as CVE 2026-31431, is a vulnerability in how Linux handles certain file copy operations. The details are technical, but the practical impact is that an attacker can leverage this vulnerability to escape containers, escalate privileges, or bypass security boundaries. Given how much of modern infrastructure runs on Linux, often in containerized environments, this is a critical vulnerability. What's particularly concerning about copy fail is that it affects the Linux kernel itself, not a specific application or service. That means it's present across a wide range of distributions and configurations. Patching kernel vulnerabilities often requires system reboots, which many organizations are reluctant to do on production systems, but this vulnerability is severe enough that the operational impact of rebooting needs to be weighed against the security risk of remaining vulnerable. Across all of Unit 42's recent research, we're seeing common themes. First, threat actors are increasingly sophisticated in how they hide their malware and infrastructure. Second, legitimate tools and features, like ADCS, resource files, and captive portals, are being abused in ways they weren't designed to prevent. Third, even security appliances themselves are targets, not just the systems they're meant to protect. The broader threat landscape context is that we are in a period of elevated activity. The geopolitical situation is driving nation-state actors to be more aggressive. Ransomware remains a persistent threat, and the rapid adoption of new technologies, especially AI and cloud infrastructure, is creating new attack surfaces faster than organizations can secure them. The incidents we've discussed today, the railway GCP suspension, the GitHub compromise via VS Code extensions, the Canvas breach affecting schools, these aren't isolated events. They're all part of a threat environment where attackers are well-resourced, highly motivated, and increasingly successful. Let's shift gears into artificial intelligence and machine learning, starting with the latest research from Archive. There's a fascinating paper titled Atoms of Thought, Universal EEG Representation Learning with Microstates, with the identifier Archive 260.5.20182. This research is tackling one of the really hard problems in neuroscience and brain-computer interfaces. How do we learn universal representations from EEG signals, the electrical activity we can measure from the scalp? The researchers are using something called microstates, which are brief periods where the EEG signal is relatively stable. Think of them as the atoms of thought, hence the paper's title. The idea is that by identifying and characterizing these microstates, we can learn representations of brain activity that generalize across different people and different tasks. This matters because most EEG research requires extensive calibration for each individual subject. If we could learn universal representations, we could build brain-computer interfaces and diagnostic tools that work out of the box without extensive per-person training. The implications go beyond just convenience. Universal EEG representations could enable large-scale studies of brain activity, help diagnose neurological conditions earlier, and make brain-computer interfaces accessible to people who can't undergo lengthy calibration procedures. This is fundamental research, but it's the kind of fundamental research that could eventually change how we interact with computers and how we understand the brain. Next up is multi-axis analysis of image manipulation localization, Archive 260.5.20174. This research addresses a critical problem in the age of AI-generated images and sophisticated photo editing. How do you figure out which parts of an image have been manipulated? The researchers are taking a multi-axis approach, analyzing images across different dimensions like frequency domain, noise patterns, and compression artifacts. What makes this work important is that as generative AI gets better, detecting manipulated images gets harder. We're rapidly approaching a point where synthetic images are indistinguishable from real ones to the human eye. But different manipulation techniques leave different fingerprints, and by analyzing multiple characteristics simultaneously, the researchers are improving detection accuracy. This has obvious applications in combating misinformation, but also in forensics, journalism, and any field where image authenticity matters. There's a paper on a methodology for selecting and composing runtime architecture patterns for production LLM agents, Archive 260.5.20173. This is addressing a very practical problem that anyone deploying large language models in production is facing. How do you architect the boundary between the stochastic, unpredictable LLM and the deterministic software systems it needs to interact with? The researchers argue that this boundary is critically important, but rarely treated as a first-class design concern. They propose a methodology for selecting and composing architecture patterns based on your specific requirements. For example, do you need the LLM to have direct access to databases, or should there be an intermediate validation layer? How do you handle rate limiting? How do you ensure that LLM outputs are validated before they're acted upon? These are all questions that every organization deploying AI agents is grappling with, and having a structured methodology for addressing them is valuable. Long-term power grid planning via answer set programming, Archive 260.5.20172, is applying AI to critical infrastructure planning. The power grid is facing unprecedented challenges: increasing demand, renewable energy integration, aging infrastructure, and climate change impacts. Planning for these long-term challenges requires optimizing across multiple competing objectives while satisfying complex constraints. Answer set programming is a form of declarative programming particularly well-suited to constraint satisfaction problems. The researchers are using it to model power grid planning decisions, allowing utilities to explore different scenarios and optimize for factors like reliability, cost, and environmental impact. This is exactly the kind of problem where AI can provide value, not replacing human decision makers, but giving them better tools to understand trade-offs and make informed choices. There's research on flood prediction in Bangladesh titled Hayor Flood Alert, deseasonalized ML ensemble for 72-hour flood prediction in Bangladesh Hayor wetlands, Archive 260.5.20167. The Hayor wetlands in Bangladesh are particularly vulnerable to flash floods that can destroy rice harvests with almost no warning. The researchers have developed a machine learning ensemble that can predict floods 72 hours in advance. What's innovative here is the deseasonalization component. Bangladesh has distinct seasonal patterns, and naive machine learning models tend to just learn these patterns rather than learning to predict anomalous flood events. By deseasonalizing the data, the researchers are helping the model focus on the signals that actually predict floods. This is practical AI that could save lives and livelihoods. If farmers have 72 hours warning, they can harvest early or take other protective measures. Finally, there's not every rubric teaches equally. Policy-aware rubric rewards for ILVR, Archive 260 5.20164. This is about reinforcement learning with verifiable rewards, which has become hugely important for post-training of large language models. When you can automatically verify whether a model's output is correct, like with code that either runs or doesn't, or math problems with checkable answers, you can use reinforcement learning to improve the model. But the researchers point out that not all rubrics for evaluating correctness are equally effective for teaching. A rubric might accurately assess whether an answer is right or wrong, but if it doesn't provide the right learning signal about why it's wrong or how to improve, the model won't learn efficiently. They propose policy-aware rubrics that take into account what the model needs to learn, not just what constitutes a correct answer. This is a subtle but important insight that could make reinforcement learning from verifiable rewards significantly more effective. Looking at the broader AI landscape beyond these papers, we're seeing a really interesting moment. On one hand, we have announcements like Google's Gemini 3.5 Flash suggesting continued progress in model capabilities. On the other hand, we're seeing growing skepticism about whether these improvements are translating into real value. The discussion on Hacker News around Gemini 3.5 was notably lukewarm, lots of "show me what it can actually do that previous models couldn't" sentiment. There's also the ongoing debate about AI replacing creative work. Reddit's artificial community has a post with over 1,300 points showing what they call AI versus creativity from a pro-AI greedy corpo, highlighting the tension between AI as a tool to augment human creativity versus AI as a replacement for human creators. Barnes & Noble's CEO has said they're open to selling AI-written books in stores, which is generating backlash from authors and readers who worry about quality and the devaluation of human creativity. The economic implications of AI are starting to become clearer. Bloomberg's Peter Orszag describes the US economy as a levered bet on AI, suggesting that a significant portion of current market valuations and economic growth projections are dependent on AI delivering the productivity gains that are being promised. If AI underdelivers, or if adoption is slower than expected, or if the technology hits fundamental limitations, the economic impact could be significant. At the same time, we're seeing practical applications of AI that are genuinely useful. The NASA-developed AI for tracking harmful algae blooms, the flood prediction system for Bangladesh, the image manipulation detection research. These are all examples of AI being applied to real problems in ways that create clear value. The challenge for the AI industry is to focus more on these concrete applications and less on hype about artificial general intelligence and existential risk. Segment 6, HOMELAB and infrastructure. All right, let's talk Homelab and infrastructure. And folks, there's a lot happening in this space today. First up, GitHub security is having a rough week. Bleeping Computer is reporting that GitHub has confirmed a breach affecting 3,800 repositories through a malicious VS Code extension. This is a supply chain attack that's particularly concerning because it leverages trust in the development toolchain itself. The extension apparently contained malicious code that exfiltrated repository data when developers installed it. GitHub says they've identified the compromised extension and are working with affected users, but this is a stark reminder that even our development tools can be weaponized. And it gets worse. Lobsters is covering what's being called the Team PCP breach, where a group claims to have accessed GitHub's internal source code. GitHub is investigating, but the cybersecurity community is taking this seriously. There's even an interview with Team PCP over on Buy Me a Coffee that's making the rounds. The SANS Internet Storm Center has published a detailed analysis of the Team PCP supply chain campaign with activity tracked through May 17th. Over on Reddit's sysadmin community, there's a thread with over 700 upvotes discussing the alleged breach, so this is definitely top of mind for infrastructure folks right now. Speaking of GitHub, there's some good news on the trending repositories front. A project called Code Graph is getting attention, and there's a new repository focused on AI engineering from scratch that might be worth checking out for anyone looking to understand how to build infrastructure for AI workloads. Now, Grafana users need to pay attention to this one. Bleeping Computer reports that a Grafana breach was caused by a missed token rotation after the TANstack attack. This is a perfect example of how security incidents can cascade. The initial TANstack compromise led to exposed credentials, and when those tokens weren't rotated quickly enough, attackers used them to access Grafana infrastructure. If you're running Grafana, now would be a good time to audit your token rotation policies and make sure you have automated processes in place. For those running Drupal sites, there's a critical update you need to apply. Bleeping Computer is reporting that Drupal has released a patch for a bug with high exploitation risk. The details are being kept relatively quiet to prevent immediate exploitation, but the severity rating tells you everything you need to know. If you have Drupal in your infrastructure, patch now, ask questions later. Arch Linux users, we've got a root escalation flaw called pin theft that you need to know about. An exploit has been released, according to Bleeping Computer, so this is actively exploitable in the wild. The vulnerability involves how Arch handles certain authentication mechanisms, and it can allow a local attacker to escalate to root privileges. The Arch security team has patches available, so update your systems. On the container front, there's news from the Hocus Pocus project. Over on Hacker News, there's a show HN post about Hocus Pocus version 4, which is a self-hosted IDGs collaboration backend. For those not familiar, IDGs is a conflict-free replicated data type framework that's really useful for building collaborative applications. Hocus Pocus 4 makes it easier to self-host these collaboration backends, which is great for homelabbers who want to run their own document collaboration without relying on cloud services. ChromaDB users need to be aware of a maximum severity flaw. Bleeping Computer reports that a vulnerability in ChromaDB, which is a vector database commonly used in AI applications, allows for complete server hijacking. This is particularly concerning because ChromaDB has become a popular choice for RAG pipelines and semantic search applications. The CVSS score is maxed out, so if you're running ChromaDB, you need to update immediately. Microsoft has shared a mitigation for a Windows 0 day being tracked as yellow key. Reddit's sysadmin community has a thread about this with the CVE details. The vulnerability affects BitLocker, and Bruce Schneier has written about it on his blog, calling it a zero-day exploit against Windows BitLocker. The mitigation involves some registry changes and group policy updates, and Microsoft says a full patch is coming in the next Patch Tuesday cycle. By the way, speaking of Patch Tuesday, Krebs on Security has their usual Patch Tuesday, May 2026 edition post up, which is always worth reading for a comprehensive overview of what Microsoft fixed this month. There's also concerning news from Krebs about a CISA admin who leaked AWS GovCloud keys on GitHub. Yes, you heard that right. A cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency administrator accidentally pushed AWS GovCloud credentials to a public GitHub repository. The keys have been revoked, but this is embarrassing for an agency that's supposed to be setting security standards. It's also a good reminder that even security professionals make mistakes, and that's why we need automated secret scanning in our CI/CD pipelines. Unit 42 from Palo Alto Networks has several interesting threat reports out. They're tracking something called tampered-chef via certificate and code reuse. There's also an analysis of Gremlin Stealer's evolved tactics, where the malware is hiding in plain sight using resource files. And they've published a deep dive on Active Directory certificate services exploitation that's worth reading if you're managing Windows infrastructure. They also have a threat brief on exploitation of a PAN-OS captive portal 0-day for unauthenticated remote code execution. If you're running Palo Alto firewalls, make sure you're patched. And perhaps most concerning, they're covering what they call the most severe Linux threat in years, tracked as CVE 2026-31431, nicknamed Copy Fail. On the home automation front, Hacker News has a discussion about formal verification gates for AI coding loops. This is an interesting approach to making AI-generated code safer by applying formal methods to verify that the code meets certain specifications before it's deployed. In more positive infrastructure news, Reddit's Homelab community is as active as ever. There's a thread with over 300 upvotes celebrating a $40 Amazon shelf being used as a server rack. Honestly, some of the best Homelabs I've seen use creative solutions like this. There's also someone showing off a 10-inch Kallax Homelab rack that's generating a lot of discussion. The Plex pricing news is causing waves too. Plex has increased their lifetime pass to $748.99, and Reddit's Homelab community has a thread with over 1,400 upvotes discussing it. A lot of people are considering alternatives like Jellyfin at this point. On the networking side, Ars Technica has an article about the fight over users' right to tweak smart TV software heading to trial. This is about forcing Vizio to share Linux-based source code for its TV operating system, and it has implications for the entire smart TV industry and the right to repair movement. Segment 7, Science and Space. Let's shift gears and look up at the cosmos for a bit. NASA has had a busy week with several significant announcements. The Psyche spacecraft has completed its Mars flyby. This is a major milestone for the mission, which is ultimately headed to the metallic asteroid Psyche in the main belt between Mars and Jupiter. The Mars flyby is a gravity assist maneuver that will help propel the spacecraft toward its ultimate destination. What makes Psyche so interesting is that scientists believe it might be the exposed core of a protoplanet that lost its outer layers in ancient collisions. Studying it could give us insights into planetary formation and the cause of terrestrial planets like Earth. NASA is also providing an update on their moon-based strategy and missions. The Artemis program continues to move forward, and the agency is laying out their long-term vision for sustained lunar presence. We're not just talking about flags and footprints this time around. NASA is planning for permanent infrastructure on the moon, including habitats, power systems, and communication networks. The briefing will cover how this fits into the broader goal of using the moon as a stepping stone to Mars. There's also news about NASA releasing technology priorities to energize the space industry. This is part of their effort to work more closely with commercial partners and make sure that emerging technologies are aligned with NASA's mission needs. The space industry has changed dramatically in recent years, with companies like SpaceX proving that commercial spaceflight is viable, and NASA is adapting their approach accordingly. Speaking of technology, NASA has developed AI that could help track harmful algae. This is using satellite imagery combined with machine learning to identify and monitor algal blooms in bodies of water. These blooms can be toxic to humans and wildlife, and they're becoming more common as climate patterns shift. Being able to track them from space and predict where they'll occur could help protect water supplies and ecosystems. In the I Am Artemis series, NASA features Tim Goddard, highlighting the people working behind the scenes on the Artemis program. These profiles are always interesting because they show the human side of space exploration. Now, there's a fascinating space mystery developing with Neptune's moon Nereid. According to AP News, a new study using data from the James Webb Space Telescope shows that Nereid may be an original moon, meaning it formed alongside Neptune rather than being captured later. This is significant because most of Neptune's irregular moons are thought to be captured objects. Nereid's orbit is highly eccentric, which has led to speculation about its origins. If it turns out to be primordial, it could tell us a lot about conditions in the outer solar system during planetary formation. Moving to terrestrial science, there's concerning news about an Ebola outbreak. AP News and the BBC are both reporting that Ebola fears are surging in the Democratic Republic of Congo over rapid spread of a rare type. The WHO is warning that an Ebola vaccine could take 9 months to develop for this particular strain, and the death toll continues to rise. This is the Bundibugyo strain of Ebola, which is different from the more common Zaire strain that most vaccines target. NPR has coverage calling this a rare Ebola strain with no vaccine currently available. What makes this particularly challenging is that the outbreak is in a region with ongoing conflict, which makes it difficult to implement containment measures and contact tracing. The WHO is working with local health authorities, but the situation is being described as serious. On a lighter note, there's an interesting piece from AP News about Japan's mass hay fever problem tracing back to a 1950s reforestation blunder. After World War II, Japan planted massive numbers of cedar trees as part of reforestation efforts. The problem is they chose a species that produces enormous amounts of pollen, and now millions of Japanese people suffer from severe hay fever every spring. It's a cautionary tale about unintended consequences of large-scale environmental interventions. The weather here in Wonder Lake continues to be classic late May overcast conditions. We're sitting at 58 degrees right now, feeling like 53 with that wind. The forecast for the rest of the week shows us staying in the upper 50s with overcast conditions through Thursday, then some drizzle moving in Friday with about 0.087 inches of precipitation. But the weekend looks better. Saturday we'll see temperatures climb to around 70 degrees, and Sunday should hit the mid-70s. So if you're planning outdoor activities, Sunday looks like your best bet. For those interested in astronomy, even though we've got overcast skies locally, NASA's astronomy picture of the day is always worth checking out. The images from earlier this week are available on their website, and they're continuing their tradition of showcasing the universe one photograph at a time. Segment 8, Business, Economy and Local. Let's talk about the business world and what's happening economically, then we'll touch on local news. The Federal Reserve minutes from their latest meeting are making waves. Bloomberg is reporting that the minutes show more officials warning of a possible rate hike scenario. This is notable because markets had been pricing in rate cuts, but inflation has remained stickier than expected. Some Fed officials are concerned that if inflation doesn't continue its downward trajectory, they might need to raise rates again rather than cut them. This is putting pressure on tech stocks in particular, since higher rates make future earnings less valuable in present terms. Speaking of tech stocks, all eyes are on Nvidia earnings. Bloomberg has a piece about how Nvidia's upcoming earnings report is set to make or break the chip stock rally. Nvidia has been a bellwether for the AI infrastructure build-out, and their guidance will tell us whether data center spending is continuing at the pace investors expect. There's a lot riding on this report. Treasury yields jumped after President Trump cited final stages with Iran, according to Bloomberg. The geopolitical situation continues to be a major factor in markets, and any hint of resolution or escalation moves prices significantly. Peter Orszag, in comments to Bloomberg, described the US economy as a levered bet on AI. That's a pretty stark way to put it, but there's truth there. A lot of the stock market gains over the past couple years have been concentrated in companies that are either building AI infrastructure or promise to benefit from AI deployment. If that thesis doesn't play out as expected, we could see significant corrections. In tech industry news, the railway incident with Google Cloud Platform continues to reverberate. Hacker News has multiple threads about this, including an incident report from Railway and a discussion asking whether Google needs to give a public statement. Railway's entire GCP account was suspended, taking down their platform and affecting their customers. The incident raises questions about cloud, provider policies, and the risks of being dependent on a single cloud vendor. There's a thread on Hacker News with over 200 upvotes where someone says, "Apparently Google hates us now," which captures the frustration a lot of developers feel about dealing with large cloud providers. Google is also in the news for blocking human rights accounts from reaching audiences in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, according to a story on Hacker News from ALQST. This has over 700 upvotes and 300 comments, indicating it's a significant concern in the tech community. Meta is being accused of similar practices. These stories raise important questions about how platforms operate in authoritarian countries and whether they're too willing to comply with government censorship requests. On a more positive note, there's a big settlement in a First Amendment case. Ars Technica, NPR, ABC News, and PBS are all covering the story of a Tennessee man who was jailed for 37 days over a Trump meme he posted about Charlie Kirk. He's now won an $835,000 settlement. This case involved a sheriff who arrested the man for social media posts, which is a pretty clear First Amendment violation. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression calls it a victory, and it serves as a reminder that even in 2026, we have to actively defend free speech rights. Former Congressman Barney Frank has died at 86. NPR, AP News, and NBC News have coverage. Frank was a liberal congressman and a trailblazer for gay rights, serving Massachusetts for decades and being instrumental in financial reform legislation after the 2008 crisis. The Dodd-Frank Act bears his name, and his legacy on both LGBTQ rights and financial regulation will be felt for generations. Locally here in McHenry County, let's talk about what's happening in our community. WGN News Chicago is covering a tragic fire in West Englewood, where 2 people died and several were injured. Several people were rescued from the burning home overnight, and first responders are still investigating the cause. The Obama Presidential Center is having its grand opening, and the Obama Foundation has announced a free watch party. If you're in the Chicago area and want to attend, tickets are available. This has been a long time coming, and it's a significant addition to the South Side. In sports news, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell is offering updates on the Chicago Bears stadium situation. He says he's spoken to the governor about the proposed development, and negotiations continue on what would be a major infrastructure project for the city. Over in Lake County, which is just east of us, a Lake Central High School student has been charged after a cafeteria fight. These school incidents are always concerning for parents in the area. And DuPage County, which is southeast of here, has a disturbing case where a corrections officer has been charged with disseminating child sexual abuse material and has been fired. It's always particularly troubling when law enforcement personnel are involved in these crimes. For Wonder Lake residents specifically, we're moving into summer event season. With the weather improving this weekend, it's a good time to check local event calendars for Memorial Day weekend activities. The American Legion Post usually has something planned, and local parks will be opening more facilities as we move into warmer weather. The housing market in McHenry County remains competitive, though higher interest rates have cooled things somewhat from the frenzy of recent years. If you're thinking about buying or selling, it's still a market where good properties move quickly, but buyers have a bit more negotiating room than they did 2 years ago. Segment 9, outro, and that brings us to the end of today's episode of the Clovis Brief. We covered a lot of ground today, from major security incidents affecting GitHub and development infrastructure, to space exploration milestones with the Psyche spacecraft, to economic uncertainty as the Fed considers its next moves. We talked about the ongoing situation in Iran, local news here in McHenry County, and the ethical questions around social media platforms operating in authoritarian countries. Tomorrow we'll be diving into some of the AI developments we touched on today, including those new models from Qwen and what Google's I/O announcements mean for the future of search. We'll also have more on the cybersecurity landscape as investigations continue into these supply chain attacks. As always, all the links for today's stories are in the show notes. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with someone who might benefit from staying informed about technology and security. Stay curious, stay secure, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. This is the Clovis Brief.